When I was little, I used to press my ear against the living room radiator just to hear the whispers it made in winter. It sounded like secrets from another world, voices humming just beneath the surface, telling truths no one else could hear. I think that's where I learned to listen not with my ears, but with my whole being. To the quiet pauses in conversation, to the glances not meant to be noticed, to the tremor in a voice that said more than the words themselves. That's how I knew, even before she said it, that my mother believed my brother was the only one worthy of her legacy. She never said it cruelly, not outright. No, she was far more elegant in her dismissals. "Michael has a head for business," she'd say at dinner, as I passed her the peas. "You were always better with people, dear. People, not power. Compassion, not control." Growing up, I learned to read the language of omission. My report cards lined with A's, praised by every teacher, were quietly tucked away in drawers. Michael's C+ in economics came with balloons and a steak dinner. When he won his high school debate, the family photo went into a silver frame on the mantel. When I was named valedictorian, she smiled, said "That's lovely, sweetheart," and changed the subject to what he might wear to his internship. I carried the weight of that silence into adulthood, the kind that makes you feel transparent. Like glass. Useful for seeing others, but never meant to be seen. When she fell ill, it was sudden lung cancer, already in stage 4. Michael, busy as ever, flew in for a weekend, kissed her forehead like a diplomat in a hospice visit, then returned to his spreadsheets and stock options. "I'll handle the legal stuff," he told me on his way out. "You just focus on being here." Being here. He meant the hospital room, the silence, the body that began to betray her one cell at a time. The feeding tubes, the nighttime screams, the diapers. The waiting. And I did. I was there. Morning and night. I read to her from books she never finished. I played her favorite records, the ones she used to hum along to while vacuuming. I brushed her hair when her hands shook too much. I held the oxygen mask when she cried. Sometimes, in the late hours, when the morphine softened the sharpness of her mind, she'd look at me and whisper, "Thank you." Her voice always trembled as though she couldn't believe it was I who stayed. Maybe some small part of her had begun to understand. The night she passed, Michael didn't make it in time. His plane was delayed. "Tell her I love her," he texted. I didn't read it out loud. I just held her hand and said, "I'm here." I wanted her last words to be her own. At the funeral, the sky was steel gray and unsympathetic. I wore black not because I was mourning, but because I felt invisible again. Everyone clung to Michael's arm. He was the good son, the successful one, the rightful heir. And then the lawyer approached me. He was an older man with kind eyes and weathered hands. "Your mother asked me to give you this," he said, pressing a small brass key into my palm. My fingers curled around it instinctively, as though I already knew the shape by heart. "She changed the will 6 weeks ago," he added. "It's all yours. House, savings, everything." I remember Michael's face. Blank at first, then cracking open with disbelief. "What?" he said. Just that. Like it was a glitch in the universe. I just nodded. And for the first time in my life, I didn't explain myself. I didn't justify or apologize. I let the silence speak. Because sometimes, the inheritance isn't just about property or bank accounts. Sometimes, it's finally being seen, heard, chosen. The key was small, brass, slightly tarnished, and warm from where it had rested in my palm. I traced the grooves with my thumb that night as I sat alone on the edge of my childhood bed, the one with the pale floral comforter, the dresser still lined with old trophies and framed school certificates, dust-laced evidence of a life lived quietly in the shadows. I hadn't cried at the funeral. Not during the service, not as they lowered her casket into the ground beside my father's. I'd stood still, as steady as a statue, the kind you find in neglected gardens, weathered but dignified, unacknowledged but unbroken. But now, in the silence of a house that no longer whispered with her voice, I let the tears fall. Not for her, exactly. For the girl I used to be. The one who brought her orange juice every morning without being asked. The one who spent Christmas Eves untangling lights alone while Michael smiled for the camera. The one who waited year after year to be chosen. And who now held the key to everything. I didn't open the door until morning. The lawyer had told me what the key unlocked, but I already knew. It wasn't just a front door. It was a door to every memory that had clung to this house like ivy, growing silently, stubbornly, wrapping itself around every crack and crevice. I stood on the porch and stared at the brass lock. How many times had I stood here carrying groceries, rain-soaked and ignored, while Michael breezed past, the favored son home from college? I slid the key in. The lock turned with surprising ease, almost as if it had been waiting for me all this time. The door swung open, and the scent hit me first: lemons and old books, lavender and cedarwood, 1,000 memories layered in wax polish and dust. Everything was exactly as she left it. The living room still bore the deep imprint of her life, the floral couch with the sagging cushions, the fireplace mantel crowded with Michael's framed diplomas and none of mine, the cabinet with fine china we never used. It was a museum of her chosen memories, curated with intention. And yet now it was mine. I wandered slowly, my footsteps soft, reverent. In the dining room, the mahogany table was still set for 6, though no one had gathered here for years. In the hallway, the wall clock ticked solemnly, unbothered by grief. Upstairs, I paused at her bedroom door. I hadn't gone inside since the hospice bed was wheeled out, stripped of its linen and meaning. Now I reached for the knob, unsure if it would open without protest. It did. The room was dim and still. Her perfume lingered in the air like a ghost, sweet and delicate. On her nightstand, beside her glasses and the crossword book she never finished, was a photograph. It was a picture of me. Just me. I stared at it, stunned. I didn't remember when it was taken, but I looked younger, early 20s, maybe. My smile was soft, hopeful. It was framed in a simple silver edge, no dust, no smudges. It had been touched recently. Something broke open inside me. Not loudly, not violently, just a quiet shift, like ice cracking on a winter lake. I sank onto her bed, that photo trembling in my hands, and whispered into the stillness. Why? Why only now? Why not when I needed to hear it most? The truth is, I didn't know. Maybe she regretted the imbalance near the end. Maybe the cancer softened the scaffolding of pride she'd built her life upon. Or maybe she realized, in those final days, that love isn't measured by success or status, but by the quiet, unwavering presence of someone who stays. I stayed. Not because I expected reward, but because it was right. Because she was still my mother, even with her faults. Even after the years of silence. And now she'd left me everything. The house, the savings, the legacy, and somewhere in the marrow of that inheritance was something I hadn't expected, a chance to begin again. Not just with walls and rooms and financial security, but with the knowledge that I had always been enough. That my worth wasn't hidden in dusty corners. It had simply never been seen by the ones too blind to look. I rose from her bed, the photograph still in hand, and opened the window. Fresh air poured in. This house had stories to tell. But for the first time, the story would be mine. It took 3 days before I opened the kitchen cabinets. I don't know why I waited. Perhaps because that was where the weight of the past was heaviest. Not the formal dining room, not the photo-cluttered living room, but here, among the cupboards of mismatched mugs and the drawer that never quite closed properly, the echoes lived loudest. The kitchen had always been her domain. Not in the warm, nurturing way movies paint mothers, baking cookies with flour on their noses. My mother's kitchen was a fortress of expectations. Meals prepared with military precision. Dinners served promptly at 6. No one dared enter without permission. Except Michael. He'd swing in, arms full of charm and stories about his latest ventures, and she would light up. I remember watching her cut fruit for him the way she never did for me, as if even her hands knew where her heart leaned. But now, the kitchen was mine. I pulled open the drawer by the stove. The same collection of wooden spoons, cracked spatulas, and half-melted measuring cups lay inside. And tucked beneath them, a torn recipe card with her handwriting, soft cursive, elegant but hurried in spots. It was a recipe for apple pie, a dish she never once made for us. I turned it over. There was a note. Your grandmother's favorite. She used to let me roll the dough. I was never very good at it. I stared at the words, my breath catching in my throat. My mother, vulnerable. Admitting imperfection. A part of her I never knew she had shared so willingly with herself on the back of a card meant for memory, not for show. I folded the paper carefully and slid it into my pocket. There were more surprises. Above the fridge, a tin box. I had to climb onto a chair to reach it. Inside, old letters, folded tightly, some addressed to my mother from her own mother. Others unsent, written by my mother to me. The first one was dated 5 years ago. You'll never read this, but I need to say it somewhere. I don't know why I can't say it aloud. Maybe because pride is thicker than love sometimes, and mine is bone deep. Her words blurred, not from age, but from the sudden rush of tears that stung my eyes. I sat on the cold kitchen tile and read every letter. They spanned years. Small confessions, quiet regrets, apologies tucked between grocery lists and memories. Each word was a key of its own. When I looked up, it was dusk. The sky outside the kitchen window had turned the color of ripe peaches, and for a moment, the whole room glowed. I remembered sitting at that same window as a girl, watching snow fall while my mother stirred soup, humming under her breath. And I realized something. I had spent years grieving a relationship that might have been. But here, in ink and paper, was a relationship that had quietly tried to grow beneath all the rigid surfaces. It was flawed. It was late. But it was something. The next morning, Michael called. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. Tell me you're not keeping the house. I let the silence fill the space between us. Let him hear the walls, the clock ticking, my breath. I'm not just keeping it, I said. I'm living in it. His laugh was dry, bitter. She didn't even know what she was doing near the end. You know that. She was on pain meds, confused. She knew exactly what she was doing, I replied, my voice steady. You signed the power of attorney papers. You agreed to it all. I thought I was signing a medical directive. You should have read more carefully, I said, then paused. Like I always did. He muttered something under his breath, something that didn't quite land. But I wasn't angry. I didn't feel the heat of old resentment rising in my chest. Instead, I felt strangely free. Because for once, the weight of proving myself wasn't mine to carry. He hung up without saying goodbye. I set the phone down, walked into the living room, and sat in my mother's old armchair. The sun poured through the windows, warming the threadbare fabric. I rested my hand on the armrest, and for a fleeting moment, I felt her there beside me. Not the woman she had been all my life, but the one in those letters. The one who tried, imperfectly, silently, to reach me. I see you, I whispered. And for the first time, I believed she might have seen me too. The house creaked differently at night. Not with menace or ghosts, but like an old woman murmuring in her sleep, half-formed memories slipping between the floorboards. I found myself learning its rhythms anew, like a language I once knew but had grown rusty in speaking. I slept in my mother's room the first week. Not out of nostalgia or necessity, but to make peace. Her closet still held the scent of her favorite perfume, jasmine and something powdery, and the ghost of her presence lingered on the pillow beside mine. I whispered things into the dark she never gave me space to say aloud. How lonely I had been, how tired, how invisible I felt growing up beneath the towering shadow of her son. I didn't speak with bitterness. I had already lived through those years. I only wanted to be heard, even if only by the walls. During the days, I wandered from room to room sorting, always sorting. Her jewelry box still held every brooch I remembered, many of them costume pieces, none of great value, but each worn with ceremonial pride on Sundays and special holidays. I took one, an enamel hummingbird missing one rhinestone, and pinned it to my sweater. It felt like armor. Then came the attic. I hadn't been up there in over a decade, not since high school when I'd hidden there once to cry after a particularly cruel family dinner. Michael had made a joke at my expense, and the room erupted in laughter. My mother had chuckled too, patting his hand affectionately. I excused myself, climbed into the attic, and stayed there for hours beneath the dusty eaves, staring at old trunks and cobwebbed boxes like they were the only things in the house that didn't expect me to smile. Now, I opened the attic door again, the smell of mothballs and dry air wafting down to greet me. The stairs groaned under my weight. Most of the space was as I remembered it, boxes labeled in her tight script. Christmas, tax records, Michael, school years. Nothing labeled with my name. But in the far corner, a small, unlabeled box sat alone. It was dusty, its corners softened with age. Inside were notebooks, old, spiral-bound, some stained with tea or coffee. I opened one, and the breath caught in my chest. They were mine. Journals I'd kept as a girl, once thrown out in a teenage tantrum after she said I was too emotional and too soft for this world. I had assumed they were gone forever, yet here they were, rescued, stored, hidden. Tears welled, unbidden. Did she save them out of guilt? Out of love? Or simply because she couldn't bring herself to throw them away? I didn't know. But I chose to believe the best of her in that moment. Because in that attic, with dust dancing in a slant of sunlight, I realized something sacred. She had watched me more closely than I thought. Perhaps not in the way I needed then. But she had noticed. Enough to tuck these pieces of me away when I wasn't looking. I gathered the journals and brought them downstairs, stacking them neatly beside my bed. That night, I read through pages written in the voice of a girl still hungry for approval. Michael got a new bike. I didn't say anything when Mom forgot my art show. Again. I just smiled. Maybe she'll notice next time. They said I was too sensitive. I think it's better than being mean. I hope I never become hard like them. I want to be seen. I want to matter. I read until the pages blurred. Then I turned off the light and whispered aloud, "You do matter. You always did." And for the first time, I felt the echo answer back, not from the walls, but from within myself. It was a Wednesday when I changed the locks. Not for safety, not out of fear, but as an act of reclamation. For years, this house had been a place of visiting, of asking permission, of feeling like a guest in a life that ran parallel to mine. Now it was mine, and the simple click of a new deadbolt felt louder than any declaration I could have made. Michael called again that afternoon. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't offer condolences. His voice came clipped, brittle, the kind of tone he used when negotiating lease terms or returns at high-end stores. "We need to talk about the estate," he said. "There's nothing to talk about," I replied, my voice calm. "You're really keeping everything." "It was her choice," I said. "You manipulated her," he snapped. "She wasn't in her right mind." "I was here," I said quietly. "You weren't." That silence on the other end, so familiar, so cold, stretched longer than I expected. Then he hung up. No goodbye, no acknowledgement, no truce. But I didn't need one. I stood in the middle of the entry hall after that, barefoot on the old pinewood floor, breathing in the scent of beeswax and thyme. The sunlight streamed through the side window in golden slats, illuminating the dust motes swirling lazily in the air. I realized how quiet it had become. Not empty, but peaceful. A different kind of silence than I grew up with. This one was not full of unsaid disappointment or tiptoed expectations. This was the silence of space reclaimed. Ownership, it turns out, isn't just legal. It's emotional, spiritual. I began to make changes, not drastic ones, just small reconfigurations. I moved the furniture an inch or two. Removed some of the framed photos that always seemed to tell a story I wasn't in. Replaced them with paintings I loved, prints of artists who made me feel seen. I donated half the china collection to the local community center and boxed up Michael's trophies and school mementos. I didn't throw them out. I'm not cruel. But they no longer needed to be centerpieces in a life that never truly belonged to me. The hardest room to change was the den. That had been my father's space once. Later, it became Michael's when he came home from college. His framed diplomas still hung crookedly, too high on the wall, the nail holes visible from when they were moved around to better catch the light. I stood there for a long time, remembering how I used to bring tea into that room, how I'd stand at the threshold waiting for someone to notice me. They rarely did. Now, I took those frames down one by one. Behind them, the paint had faded slightly, outlines of what had been still visible in ghostly shadow. I ran my hand over the wall. Then I went to the closet, pulled out a can of soft blue paint I'd bought on a whim years ago, and began to cover it. Stroke by stroke, I painted over the past. That night, I slept in the den. The air still smelled faintly of fresh paint and pine. I curled up on the couch with a blanket and my old journals beside me, and I dreamed not of what had been, but what could be. And somewhere in the early hours, I woke to the sound of wind through the trees and the creak of the house settling. It didn't feel like morning anymore. It felt like coming home. The first thing I did in the morning was open every window, not just to let the stale air out, but to invite something in, something I hadn't let myself hope for in years, a beginning. The breeze carried scents of early spring, damp earth, budding lilacs, the faint trace of someone mowing a lawn nearby. The sounds of birdsong filtered in gently, stitching themselves into the silence I had grown to cherish. This house had always been composed of quiet judgments, but now it held something softer, possibility. I made coffee the way I liked it, not the way she used to, strong, with oat milk and a splash of cardamom. The kitchen, freshly reorganized, was no longer hers. It didn't hum with her expectations. It greeted me like an old friend finally seen. That morning I made a list, not a to-do list, but a to-choose list. I wrote it slowly, one item at a time. Pick new curtains, something sheer, light-catching. Remove the plastic covers from the couch. Take the hummingbird brooch to be repaired. Find the courage to host someone here, maybe just for tea. Start writing again. Writing? I paused at that one. It had been years since I'd written anything that wasn't a grocery list or an email for someone else's approval. Once, words had been mine, my escape, my sanctuary. I remembered staying up late in high school, scribbling in spiral-bound notebooks under the covers, whispering poems to myself like prayers. But life had a way of pressing its hand over your mouth until you forgot the sound of your own voice. Now, in the stillness of this reclaimed space, I wondered if I might find it again. That afternoon, I ventured into town. People recognized me, of course. "You're Marie's daughter," they said, using my mother's name like a password into their expectations. Their eyes flicked over me, assessing. I saw the glimmer of gossip in their expressions. They had heard about the will, the house, the inheritance. Small towns are like that, secrets travel faster than sound. I nodded, polite but unyielding. "Yes, I am," I said. "And I'm living there now." The words tasted strange on my tongue. Not because they weren't true, but because they finally were. At the hardware store, I picked out paint swatches, soft creams, gentle greens, stormy grays. I imagined the hallway in muted sage, the bedroom in something close to moonlight. Every choice felt like a step away from her and a step toward myself. Back at the house, I carried the color cards from room to room like offerings, holding them up to the light, asking the walls what stories they were ready to tell. In the upstairs guest room, which had always been a cold, forgotten space, I paused. That room had never been touched much. It still held the smell of linen gone stiff with age. I used to sneak in there as a child, lying on the unused bed to escape the weight of being unwanted. Now I saw potential, a studio maybe, a reading nook, a place that didn't carry the burden of memory. I opened the windows there too. Light poured in, washing over everything like absolution. That night, I brought in a desk from the attic, a narrow, creaky thing that once belonged to my grandfather. Its wood nicked and softened with use. I placed it against the far wall and set down a clean notebook, the first I'd touched in years. And I wrote. Only a few lines. Nothing profound. But they were mine. Unearned by suffering, unfiltered by fear. This house no longer mourns. It breathes. And for the first time, so do I. The notebook stayed on the desk, open like a door I'd finally dared to push through. Each morning I'd add a few lines, memories reshaped into metaphors, fragments of thoughts still brittle at the edges. Writing felt like gathering broken glass and crafting a window. The light it let in was jagged, yes, but real. It was on one of those quiet mornings, coffee in hand and cardigan draped around my shoulders, that I found it. I was reorganizing the drawers in the desk, removing old pencils worn to nubs and receipts so faded they read like ghost stories. The bottom drawer stuck slightly, then gave way with a reluctant groan. Beneath a stack of envelopes was a single sheet of stationery, the kind my mother only used for very important things. At the top, in her familiar hand, it read, "To be given only if she stays." The letter wasn't sealed. I hesitated, some part of me still fearing her disapproval, as if reading it might summon her ghost with pursed lips and that ever-knowing sigh. But I opened it anyway. "My dearest, if you're reading this, then you stayed. And that means something. More than I can probably say. I wasn't always kind. I know that now. You were the quieter one. The gentle one. The one I didn't know how to love because you reminded me too much of myself before I learned to bury softness beneath control. Loving you terrified me, because it meant seeing the places where I failed. And yet you stayed. You held my hand when it trembled. You didn't walk away, even when I gave you every reason to. This house was never a home for you. I made sure of that, and I'm sorry. I can't change what I did, but I can try, however feebly, to give you the chance to build what I never gave you. Make it yours. Paint the walls. Burn the old linens if you must. Laugh loudly. Cry freely. Invite people in. This place was built on silence. I hope you fill it with music. Love. Mom." I sat with the letter for a long time, the edges trembling slightly in my hands. For a woman who spent her whole life hiding vulnerability behind schedule books and tailored blouses, this was a confession deeper than I thought she could bear. And it split me open. Not with pain, but with the ache of being seen, however late. I read it 3 times. Then I folded it, placed it in the notebook on my desk, and stared out the window at the pale sky shifting into afternoon. The garden still lay dormant. Overgrown. Briars climbing the old lattice like forgotten grief. But I saw now what she couldn't say until the very end. She knew. She saw. She regretted. That night, I lit a candle and walked out into the garden. The wind had a bite to it, but I didn't mind. I found a patch of earth by the rosebush she had once planted and knelt down, breaking the soil gently with a trowel. I planted lavender, my favorite. Not hers. Because love that arrives late is still love. But building something of your own, that's power. And I wasn't afraid to begin again. The next morning, I opened the blinds in every room and stood in the light. It felt ceremonial, like shedding a skin I hadn't realized I was still wearing. The air smelled faintly of new soil and the lavender I had planted the night before, already brushing against the wind with promise. The garden had always been her curated shrine, strict rows of rose bushes, hydrangeas clipped into submission, a bird bath cleaned obsessively but rarely visited by birds. It had never been about beauty. It was about control. Now, standing barefoot on the duet grass, I saw it for what it truly was, a stage built for someone else's performance. I decided that morning to reclaim it. I pulled on gloves, tugged a wheelbarrow from the shed, and started clearing. I uprooted dead plants with names I couldn't remember, shook off memories like dirt clinging to roots. It was exhausting work, but I moved with purpose, driven not by grief, but a growing hunger to shape something with my own hands. By noon, sweat lined my back and my knees were stained green. I paused, wiped my face, and looked around. It didn't look tidy anymore. It looked alive. Later that day, I drove to the nursery in town. The young woman working the counter smiled when I asked for low maintenance, resilient perennials. "You must be new," she said, glancing at my fingernails caked with soil. "Not new," I replied. "Just starting over." I left with trays of lavender, sage, echinacea, and a small lemon balm plant that reminded me of nothing except the way it made me smile. That was reason enough. Back at the house, I planted every one of them in the soft, uneven soil. Not in rows. Not in sections. But in clusters and spirals and spills of color that made no sense to anyone but me. And that was the point. This was not a garden for admiration. It was a garden for breath, for return, for becoming. Michael showed up the next day. I saw his car before I heard the knock. Silver, sleek, self-assured. Just like him. I considered not answering the door, but some part of me wanted to face him in this new skin I was growing. He didn't bother with pleasantries. "I talked to the lawyer," he said. "This isn't fair." I opened the screen door, letting it slap behind me. "Life isn't fair, remember? That's what you always said growing up when I asked why you got everything." He blinked. "You're twisting this." "No," I said quietly. "I'm just done untwisting everything to make you comfortable." He looked around then, eyes narrowing at the scattered pots and turned earth. "You ruined her garden." "No," I said, stepping closer, dirt still under my nails. "I let it breathe." He stared at me, caught between disbelief and disdain. "She wouldn't have wanted this." "She did," I said, and I meant it not just because of the letter, but because somewhere deep down I knew. There had always been a war inside her between control and softness. And perhaps in the end, the softness won. He left without another word. That night, I sat on the back steps, watching the stars appear one by one in the ink-colored sky. The garden behind me was silent, but it was not still. I could feel the roots stretching, the petals dreaming open. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I had to prove anything to anyone. I belonged to myself. It was a week later when I took down the portrait. It had hung above the fireplace my entire life, my mother's favorite photograph of Michael and me, taken when we were 6 and 11. He stood straight, all forced confidence in his navy blazer, while I sat beside him on the garden bench, hands folded, my smile tentative, small. People used to say how charming it was. Such a sweet moment, they'd gush. But I remembered the fight that came before it, how Michael had mocked my dress, how I'd cried, how my mother had told me to fix my face before the photographer arrived. I hadn't cried in the picture, just swallowed the salt and smiled. But now, standing on the hearth, fingers curled around the gilded frame, I no longer saw a sweet family memory. I saw a monument to endurance. I set the portrait down, face first, and stood in the quiet. The bare wall looked stark at first, then like a canvas. I didn't know what I would hang there yet, but I knew it wouldn't be another lie. I spent the afternoon going through the photo albums. There were dozens leather-bound, organized by year, filled with carefully curated images of holidays, school milestones, and vacations we could barely afford, but took anyway for the sake of appearances. In album after album, Michael grinned center stage. I was always to the side, sometimes half-cropped out, sometimes holding the camera. There was one album, though, that caught me by surprise. It was tucked in the back of the drawer, the cover cracked, pages loose at the edges. Inside were photos I had never seen before. Me as a toddler, painting with my fingers on the kitchen floor. Me curled up in a blanket fort. Me reading with my head in my mother's lap. No matching outfits. No staged backdrops. Just moments. Somewhere along the line, she'd hidden these away. And now, finding them felt like discovering a secret language we never got to speak. That night, I laid the photographs out on the coffee table and chose one. It was the simplest. I was maybe 8, asleep on the couch, a book still open in my lap, sunlight warming my face. I framed it. It went above the fireplace, where the portrait used to be. It wasn't a statement. It was a reclamation. The house had always reflected my mother's values, order, perfection, and control. But now it was becoming a mirror for my own, honesty, resilience, and the quiet courage of truth. Later that week, I invited Amanda over. She had been my closest friend once, before distance, before life, before I became too preoccupied with family burdens to maintain anything that wasn't a necessity. Her face lit up when she saw me, arms open, no questions, just warmth. "It's been too long," she said. "It has," I said, and I meant it. We sat in the newly rearranged living room, sipping tea from mismatched mugs that once gathered dust behind glass. The couch cushions were soft now, no longer covered in plastic. There were throw pillows, ones I had chosen. She looked around. "It's beautiful. It feels like you." "I think it finally is," I whispered. We talked for hours about everything and nothing. About grief and change, about the ache of being unseen and the healing that comes slowly, not like a flood, but like the first trickle of spring melt. When she left, I stood on the porch and watched her drive away, my hands in the pockets of my sweater, heart full and strangely quiet. I wasn't lonely. I wasn't unfinished. The house behind me no longer bore the weight of who I had been expected to become. It stood, for the first time, as a home. My home. The first time I played music in the house, it startled me. It was a quiet Sunday morning. The sky outside was a pale wash of cloud, the kind that whispered promises of rain but never quite followed through. I was wiping down the kitchen counter when my hand brushed against the old radio, the one my mother kept above the fridge. I almost didn't turn it on. Old habits die in whispers. And one of mine was silence. Growing up, music had been rationed, reserved for cleaning days or formal dinners. It was background, never expression, never joy. But that morning, something inside me shifted. I turned the dial. Static at first, then a swell of piano, melancholic, wandering. I didn't recognize the piece, but it reached into me gently, like fingers brushing dust from an old frame. I leaned against the counter and let it play. It wasn't long before I was dancing. Barefoot. Alone. Not with grace, not with intention, but with the unfiltered rhythm of someone who had spent too long moving only in ways that didn't disturb the peace. My feet patted softly across the linoleum, my hands painting invisible patterns in the air. And as I moved, I realized this was the sound of belonging. Not applause, not approval, just the echo of my own footsteps in a house that was finally listening. Later that afternoon, I found myself rearranging the bookshelves. The ones in the hallway had always been rigidly alphabetized by author, then subject, biographies, medical journals, etiquette guides. I remembered my mother once scolding me for placing a novel between two historical reference books. "It breaks the order," she'd said. Now, I scattered poetry between psychology, tucked fiction into the science section. I created tiny collisions of genre and theme, because life, after all, doesn't happen in neat categories. I found a place for my own favorites, two books with cracked spines and tea-stained pages, ones I'd hidden under my mattress as a teenager, fearing ridicule for the softness they inspired in me. I made space for them. I made space for me. And that night, I read aloud. To no one. To the walls. To the air. My voice was rusty, like a violin that hadn't been tuned in years. But as I read the lines of Mary Oliver and Audre Lorde and Neruda, something loosened in me. For the first time, my voice didn't tremble with uncertainty. It rang clear, resonant, homeward. Before bed, I stood at the window, watching the moon climb slow and luminous over the dark trees. The wind stirred the garden, and the lavender swayed like a sea of small promises. The house exhaled around me, and in that exhale, I heard something I had never heard before. Not her voice. Not Michael's. Mine. It was a Tuesday when Michael came back. No call. No warning. just the crunch of tires on gravel and the dull slam of his car door echoing through the open window. I stood in the hallway, heartbeat quiet but alert, like the hush before a thunderstorm. He didn't ring the bell this time. Just walked up the steps like he still had a right to. I opened the door before he could knock. Our eyes met, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. He looked the same, polished, impatient, expensive. But there was something different now, too. An edge of hesitation, maybe. Or disbelief, like he couldn't quite reconcile the soft warmth of the curtains behind me with the sister he thought he knew. "I'm not here to fight," he said. "That's good," I replied. "Because I'm not here to argue." He stepped inside cautiously, as if expecting the walls to remember the weight of his voice and protest. They didn't. I led him to the kitchen. He didn't comment on the changes, the paint color, the plants in the windowsill, the open radio playing something quiet and jazzy. But I saw the flickers in his eyes. He noticed. He just didn't know how to speak the language of change. We sat. For a while, we just sipped tea and avoided the real conversation. Then he said, "I found the papers." I raised an eyebrow. "She changed everything," he continued, voice tight. "Even the bank accounts. The house. The investments." I nodded. "Yes. She left nothing for me." "She left what she chose," I said gently. "You had your chances, Michael. She gave you everything for decades." He leaned back in the chair, eyes clouded. "I took care of the financials. I handled the insurance, the long-term care forms. That meant something. And I bathed her. Sat with her when she screamed in the night. Held her hand when she forgot where she was. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to." He looked down. "You know she loved you, right? Even if she never said it." "I know she tried to, in her way," I said, thinking of the letter in my drawer. "But love without acknowledgement doesn't always feel like love." He didn't answer. And for a long moment, we sat in the stillness that only truth can bring. Then he surprised me. "I'm selling the condo," he said. "And moving. Somewhere quiet." I blinked. "Really?" He nodded. "I've been angry. For a long time. At her. At you. At the world. And it hasn't brought me anything but silence." That, I understood. "You're welcome to stay for dinner," I said softly. His eyes flicked up to mine, surprised. "You don't have to." "I'm not doing it for you," I said. "I'm doing it for me." Because forgiveness, I was learning, wasn't about erasing the past. It was about refusing to let it hold the pen that wrote your future. We ate in near silence, the kind that wasn't cold this time, but careful, tentative. Two siblings mapping a new country between them, uncertain of the borders. When he left, he paused on the porch. "Nice garden," he said, and I almost smiled. "It's still growing." He nodded, hands in his pockets. "Aren't we all?" And then he was gone. But the air didn't feel heavy anymore. The gravel didn't bite. The door closed without a sound. And behind it, I breathed. I had nothing to prove to him. But I had everything still to build for myself. It wasn't until the middle of May that I finally opened the cedar chest. It had sat at the foot of my mother's bed for as long as I could remember, its surface always covered with a neat stack of folded blankets and a vase of artificial peonies. I used to think of it as sacred off-limits, like the shrine of someone who demanded reverence more than warmth. Now, standing in the quiet of the room she no longer filled, I touched the lid gently and lifted it. The smell hit first cedar and old perfume, the past distilled into scent. Inside were layers of her, wedding photographs bound in ribbon, brittle lace from a dress I had never seen her wear, a diary with a lock long rusted shut. Beneath them all, folded neatly in tissue paper, was a mirror. Small, oval, its silver frame tarnished with time. I lifted it out and held it up to my face. I expected to see her. I braced for it, the cheekbones, the sharp mouth, the eyes that always seemed to hold both judgment and longing. But what I saw wasn't her. It was me. And, for the first time, I didn't flinch. I studied my face the way I might a stranger's portrait, curious, uncritical. I noticed the soft creases at the corners of my eyes from years of quiet smiles, the way my mouth curved more on one side than the other, the small scar near my brow from falling off a bike when I was 9. I saw a woman made from silence and survival, from devotion and defiance, from years of being overlooked and the slow, deliberate choosing of herself. I saw someone worth being. I placed the mirror on the dresser, angled it toward the window. Let it reflect the morning light, not just a face. That day, I called a contractor. I wanted to renovate the sunroom. It had always been a cold, unused space filled with dying plants and brittle wicker furniture. My mother kept the shades drawn tight in there, as if too much sunlight might expose something she wasn't ready to see. But I was ready. The contractor came by Thursday. A woman named Diane, sharp-eyed and practical, with calloused hands and a quiet confidence I immediately respected. She walked through the space with a critical eye. "Plenty of potential," she said. "What do you want it to be?" I didn't hesitate. "Warm," I said. "And open. A place to breathe." She nodded like she understood more than I'd said. "We can make that happen." For the next few weeks, the house filled with new sounds, hammering, laughter, the occasional burst of music from the cruise radio. The rhythm of creation, not repair. Every evening, I walked through the changing room and felt a strange flutter in my chest, like watching a child you thought would never speak finally sing. At night, I dreamed of light. Rooms filled with color and sound. I dreamed of long tables with strangers and friends, of poetry readings in the garden, of music spilling from the windows and dancing barefoot beneath the moon. Not all of it would come true, but some of it would. Because now I understood. This house was never meant to be a museum of memory. It was meant to become. Just like me. It was a rainy Friday when the letter came. The kind of rain that fell straight and hard, without apology, no mist, no teasing drizzle, just sky spilling its sorrow in long, silver streaks. I was sipping tea in the newly painted sunroom, the walls now a pale honey yellow that caught even the dullest light and made it golden. The contractor had just left. The final nail was in. The floor had been sanded smooth, the windows cleaned of decades of neglect. And into that fresh space, the past knocked again. The envelope was thick, the paper heavy. My name in elegant script, familiar yet formal. Inside, a letter from Aunt Clara, my mother's older sister, the family's unofficial historian, and once, long ago, my favorite adult. I hadn't seen her in nearly a decade. Her voice rose from the page like the scent of old books, careful, measured, edged with emotion that refused to show itself fully. "Dearest, I heard about the house. And everything else. I debated whether to write it all, but silence is a coward's comfort. Your mother and I had our differences, as you know. But I loved her. And I loved you, though I doubt you ever felt it. I saw you at the funeral, standing alone, strong. I wanted to say something, but grief has a way of putting lead in the throat. So I say it now. I am proud of you. And if you're open to it, I would like to come see the house one last time. Not for her. For you. With hope. Clara." I read the letter twice, the second time slower. There was no guilt in her words. No excuse. Just a reaching. And I found that I didn't feel fear or anger. Only a quiet curiosity. I wrote her back the same day. "Clara, I'm here. The door is open if you come without expectations. With sincerity. Me." She arrived the next week, her coat damp, her eyes sharper than I remembered. She had aged with defiance, hair silver but wild, hands weathered, spine still straight. The moment we locked eyes, something loosened. "You look just like her," she said softly. "I know," I replied. "But I'm not her. I can see that." I led her through the house. She moved slowly, absorbing every change. Her hand brushed the walls, her gaze lingered on the photographs I'd replaced. When we reached the sunroom, she stopped and turned to me. "She never let me in here," Clara said. said it was unfinished. Too drafty. It's finished now, I said. She smiled then, a real one, not the polite kind passed at holidays. You did more than inherit this house, she said. You transformed it. I nodded, not needing her approval but letting it land all the same. She stayed for tea. We talked of small things, the garden, the books, the lavender that had already begun to bloom. And just before she left, she reached into her purse and pulled out a photograph, black and white, edges curling. It was me, maybe 4 years old, in Clara's arms, laughing. She sent this to me once, she said. In one of her rare soft spells. I kept it. I took it from her slowly, held it like something delicate. I didn't know she shared me. She did, Clara whispered. Just not often. But she did. When Clara left, I placed the photograph on the desk in the sunroom. Not as proof, but as a thread. The past, the present, and me woven not into a tapestry of pain, but into a story still unfolding. It was an ordinary afternoon when I opened the last door. The attic, the closets, the sunroom, they had all been seen, tended, transformed. But there was one room I had left untouched, the sewing room. Not because I had forgotten it. Because I remembered too much. It had once belonged to my grandmother, a space of pincushions and thimbles, neatly folded fabrics, and spools of thread stacked in towers of soft color. When I was small, I would sit on the floor and play with her button tin, sorting them by color or size while she hummed and stitched. After she died, my mother claimed it. Not to sew, she never had the patience, but to store things she didn't want to look at. It became a holding space for the inconvenient, old tax boxes, broken chairs, faded tablecloths. A mausoleum for memory. The door stuck slightly when I tried to open it, as if the house itself hesitated. But I pushed gently and it sighed open. Dust hung in the air like breath held too long. The curtains were yellowed with age, the air dry and stale. And there, against the far wall, still stood the old sewing table. Covered now in boxes, yes, but beneath it I could see the edge of the chair I used to sit on, my legs swinging above the floor. I stepped inside, the floorboards groaning beneath me like a welcome whispered through old bones. Box by box, I cleared the clutter. Old files, abandoned fabric scraps, rusted curtain rods. Slowly, the room began to breathe again. I wiped down the table, cleared the window, and opened it. The breeze that entered was cool and clean, like an exhale. I didn't know what I would make of the room yet. A meditation corner? A place to paint? A retreat for rainy days? But as the light streamed in and caught the edge of a pink button still wedged in the floorboards, I smiled. Perhaps this room, more than any other, had waited for me. That evening, I brought in a chair from the guest room and set it beside the table. I added a small lamp, a potted fern, a mug of chamomile. Not decoration. Intention. I didn't rush to fill it. I simply let it be. And I thought of all the things we discard to make room for someone else's version of us. How much space I had forfeited, physically, emotionally, so others could stretch their narratives across the span of my silence. But not here. This room, like this house, would carry only what I chose. That night, the moon rose clear and round above the garden. I sat on the porch steps, wrapped in a shawl, and watched as the lavender swayed under its glow. The old wind chimes sang low, their sound more music than memory now. And as I watched, I thought of my grandmother, how she used to hum while threading her needle, how she whispered, "Beauty doesn't have to be loud, dear." She was right, because in that soft moment, with my heart quieter than it had been in years, I finally understood. I had not only survived the legacy of others, I had begun to write my own. The invitation was simple. Handwritten on thick ivory cardstock I found in the back of my mother's office drawer, blank and unused, like so many of her softer intentions. I wrote in pen, carefully. You are invited to an evening in the garden. No occasion. No speeches. Just breath, tea, and something warm from the oven. Come as you are. I sent them to 5 people. Amanda, of course. Clara. My neighbor, Mrs. Doyle, who always smiled through her kitchen window but never crossed the fence line. Diane, the contractor. And Jonah, the quiet young man from the library who once complimented my poems scribbled in the margin of a returned book. It wasn't about filling the space. It was about filling it with care. I spent the week preparing, not frantically, not in that fevered way my mother used to host. There were no color-coded lists, no demands that the silverware be polished until it reflected your own discomfort. Instead, I moved slowly. I baked rosemary bread and lemon tarts. I set out mismatched chairs in the garden, twined fairy lights through the arbor. I placed cushions on the porch steps for those who preferred the ground. I let the house breathe, and in doing so, it felt more alive than ever. The evening came soft and golden. Amanda arrived first, arms full of tulips and stories. Clara followed, wearing a shawl I recognized from childhood, her eyes crinkling with something close to pride. Diane brought a bottle of wine and a joke about never showing up empty-handed to a woman who owns a hammer. Mrs. Doyle brought pie. Jonah came last, book in hand, and quietly handed me a folded note. "Thank you for inviting me into your stillness." We ate beneath the stars. We laughed, gently at first, like a symphony warming up. Then louder, full-throated, surprising even ourselves. The lavender caught the breeze and released its scent like an offering. The candles flickered. The moon rose slow and wide above the trees. And for once, I didn't feel like I was hosting from someone else's blueprint. I was living from my own. At some point, Amanda looked around and whispered, "Your mother would never believe this." I nodded. Neither would I. Because I had spent so long being the quiet one, the helper, the one who made herself smaller so others could shine. And now, without fanfare, without apology, I had become something else entirely. Not loud, not grand, but present, whole, seen. As the night wound down, my guests trickled out one by one, each leaving with soft words, warm hands, and the kind of connection that lingers long after footsteps fade. I stayed in the garden after the last door closed, bare feet in the grass, arms wrapped around myself not in defense, but in gratitude. This wasn't a celebration of victory. It was a ritual of arrival. And I had arrived.